back, everybody. It's great to see everyone back in the room for our final two sessions of the day. I have to say it's been a remarkable day and early afternoon for me, hopping through from session to session where I can and learning a lot along the way. It's been the energy's been very high, and the input and conversation has been very rich. And I expect that to continue, I suspect, now that you've all had 3 or 4 coffees. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Michelle Ryan. Michelle is a professor at Exeter University. She's a professor of social and organisational psychology. She's actually an Australian who's been in the UK for 14 years. So when we were discussing who might be an outstanding keynote, we wanted not only to have one of the world's leading thinkers on, among other things, gender in the workplace, but also someone who actually might want to come out and return home. And in fact, I learned this morning that Michelle's actually from Melbourne, and so it's something of a homecoming. And in fact, I also learned that she'll be back in 3 weeks' time for Christmas. So sorry to make you come out twice. Michelle is, for most of you, you'll know, is most well known for her identification of the phenomenon of the glass cliff, the idea that women are often promoted into precarious positions, in a sense designed to fail, something that achieved incredible press. Indeed, at the time I was working at the University of Cambridge, Michelle came and gave a talk on that exact topic and captivated the room of crusty Cambridge professors with very intriguing and some would say dangerous ideas. And that's what's built her global reputation. But she's known for more than that. So her work cuts across gender differences in ambition, risk-taking, work-life balance, among other things. And today her keynote is on a related topic, and it's the topic of why women don't lean in. And we've heard that term mentioned a couple of times today. So and I'm sure all of you are going to be enthralled by what Michelle has to say. So without further ado, let's welcome Michelle Ryan.
Thank you. Thanks so much. What a fantastic introduction. I like the idea of a dangerous reputation, so I hope I can live up to it today. So it's an absolute pleasure to be home and to come back. Someone said, oh, you don't sound like you've got an English accent at all, and I can hear it in my voice that I've totally just moved back to my Australian accent. So it even feels weird listening to myself speak. So I hope you can put up with me for the next 45 minutes or so. So I'm going to talk about why women don't lean in. This is a body of very recent research that we've been working on with I guess, a new body of ideas. We've just got a €2 million grant from the European Union. We thought we'd grab it just before we got kicked out of the EU. So this is really ongoing research that we're going to be doing over the next 5 years or so. But these are the sort of first initial ideas that I'd like to sort of put forwards. So really the background and where all of this research sort of stemmed from is really my desire to explain the continued persistence of workplace gender inequality. I think we can all agree that there's been great leaps and bounds, big changes in the last 50 years in terms of gender workplace equality, in terms of women's representation in the workplace, in terms of the sorts of roles and sectors that women can be in. But I think we also all have to acknowledge that while we've seen great change, it's probably not been great enough. And that while we've seen great things happen, perhaps over the last 50 years or so, what's really interesting is over the last 10 years or so, we've got massive stagnation as well. So while we have equal numbers of men and women in the workplace, we don't have equal numbers of women, say, in leadership. And we still see in the most highly prestigious sectors and the most prestigious roles that women still continue to be incredibly underrepresented. So if we're going to understand why it is that there's this stagnation, that there's this continued persistent gender inequality, we really need to delve down deep and understand the problem. Certainly historically, most of the work looking at gender inequality, gender workplace inequality, really is focused on the external barriers that are out there. So this is the work that's sort of really encapsulated under the metaphor of the glass ceiling. The idea that there are these subtle barriers out there that prevent women either rising up through the ranks or prevent them moving into certain roles or certain sectors as well. So these are things like the stereotypes that we have about gender, the stereotypes we have about leaders, the norms that are out there about what we expect, and these may be about what men and women are expected to do in terms of childcare or looking after family, the sorts of norms that are out there in terms of what's expected in terms of successful individuals. It may be about policy and practice in terms of maternity leave or childcare provision, all of these external factors that prevent women from perhaps achieving their full potential. So there's a whole body of work there in psychology, in management, in sociology, across all the different fields, really looking at what are these external barriers that prevent women rising to the top. Now, what's really interesting to me is over the last 10 years or so, there's been a bit of a shift, and I call this a bit of a pendulum shift, in the sorts of explanations that we've been looking at, both in terms of research, but also in terms of the sort of more general social discourse around gender inequality. So we've started to move away from discussions of what the external barriers are, over to looking at what women's choices are. So what do women choose to do? Where do they want to be? Where do they want their jobs? What ambitions do they have? Do they decide to stay at home or go to work? And I find this swing, I guess, really, really interesting. It's very evident, all in the research that's out there, more and more research looking at the choices that women make. And I think this is in some ways a good move. Women aren't sort of passive puzzle pieces that are affected by outside, you know, that there's a barrier there that they can't get across. They're actually active agents that make choices about their own careers. So in some ways, this shift is a useful one. Now, I think this idea of what women's choices are and how understanding women's choices might be able to elucidate the idea of gender inequality is really epitomised by Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. So Sheryl Sandberg is currently the COO, Chief Operating Officer of Facebook, and she wrote this book in 2003 based on a TED Talk that she did. So how many people are familiar with this book? How many? Okay, so lots of people familiar. How many people have read the book or bought the book? How many people have bought the book? Okay, there's a number of people. It's actually one of the most downloaded books on Amazon, okay? What's also really interesting is it's one of the least completed books on Amazon if you look at Kindle and actually finishing it. But it's certainly been incredibly influential. So in this book, Sheryl Sandberg, I guess, builds on her own success and really gives a very empowering message to women about what they should do if they want to be successful. So the idea is that you have to lean in. You have to make the right choices. You've got to take a seat at the table if you want to be successful. So she's coined a whole lot of, I guess, very empowering memes, I would say, like this. Sorry, for some reason, usually they come in one at a time and I sort of tear them apart a little bit. But no, but they're the sort of really empowering sorts of things that says about fortune favouring the bold. If someone offers you a seat on a rocket ship, don't ask what seat, just get on. And what would you do if you're not afraid? So incredibly empowering statements that are really trying to get women to make the right choices if they want to be successful. So this is the sort of, I guess, inspirational rhetoric that really is saying, you know, if you want to be successful, you've got to do the right thing. And you've got to respond to role models like Sheryl Sandberg. Now, this kind of approach about trying to make women make the right choices if they want to be successful is in part a response to what we can call the opt-out revolution. So a number of years ago, the New York Times wrote an article where they talked about the large number of incredibly successful women. So these are women that went to Ivy League schools in the US, that had gotten jobs at incredibly good companies, raised up through the ranks to a certain point, and then decided to leave by their own choice. They interviewed a whole series of these women and talked to them about their choices and what they decided to do. And here's a couple of quotes from the article. I was no longer willing to work as hard for a prize I didn't really want. Okay, so it wasn't that she faced any barrier, she decided that she didn't want to go any further. And this woman as well, I don't want to conquer the world, I don't want that kind of life. A baby provides a graceful exit. Now, I've had a baby. Graceful is not a word that I would necessarily associate with that, but you can see what these women are saying. They're saying we made choices to leave the workplace and often to look after small children or to take on caring responsibilities for family members. And it was this idea that they weren't facing external barriers, but actually they were making active choices because they didn't want to be up there. They didn't want to take on those successful roles. Okay, so we've got this idea that it isn't that women are facing barriers necessarily, but they're choosing to leave. And the New York Times coined the phrase the opt-out revolution to really talk about the large numbers of women that were leaving these organisations. So we've got Sheryl Sandberg really giving this advice, saying, well, you don't necessarily have to leave. It's in some ways to try and block this opt-out revolution of all of these women leaving. And as I said, I think in some ways, Sheryl Sandberg's sort of all of those memes are incredibly inspirational and they're incredibly empowering. And I think the idea of focusing on women as active agents in their own careers is incredibly important. But I also find it somewhat problematic. I think this focusing on women's choices places the onus of gender inequality on women themselves. If there's inequality, it's because women don't want it. So it's women's fault. It's a little bit of the blaming the victim that we've seen quite a lot of more recently in other sort of spheres as well. And what's really interesting then is that if you blame women for workplace inequality, the solution for workplace inequality is to fix women. Okay? In some ways, that's what Sheryl Sandberg's trying to do, trying to inspire them, but also to fix them, to teach them to act differently. We have negotiation academies to teach women how to negotiate better. We've got women's leadership programs to teach them to lead differently. We've got self-esteem and assertiveness training to make them more confident, to help them to lean in. Now, I'm not having a go at these things per se. Actually, I think these things can be really useful. But what they do is change women, change their leadership styles, change their approaches, change their choices. What they don't do is address structural barriers. What is out there? Why are they leaving? Why are they making the choices that they do? So by fixing women, we put the onus on women, but we ignore continuing structural barriers. Now, I think many people will be aware of the recent Google memo and the scandal around that, which was very much about a male engineer at Google who wrote a memo, for those of you that aren't aware, really talking about the sorts of diversity initiatives that they had at Google, including women's leadership programs and diversity training and assertiveness training for women, and really saying in some ways this is unfair. Now, part of the reason that he's saying it's unfair is he was saying, well, women make these choices. They don't really want to be engineers. They're not suited to be engineers. So all of the initiatives that are in place are really unfair to him. Now, this is partly because he really was completely ignoring the persistence of gender inequality in the workplace and of structural barriers that are there. I think the other approach around lean in and the idea of women making different choices is that what it does is promote individual mobility. So by giving women extra training in terms of their own career trajectories, in terms of negotiation or of assertiveness, it tries to help individual women do better. And in some ways, that's great. But that doesn't necessarily do anything for women as a whole. It does a thing for the few select women that get that leadership training or the assertiveness training or the negotiation training. And actually, if you've got this idea that women lack these things and we need to fix it, there's no end to that. It presumably means that we've just got to continue to change women as we go along, rather than perhaps looking at ways in which we can move all women along, or as I said, deal with the actual structural barriers. And in this way, what it really does is leave the status quo untouched. It suggests that women should lean in to existing structures that are there, to existing barriers that are there, to step over them, to clamber over them and those sorts of things, but not actually change the barriers that are there. My response to this, I guess, is the idea that saying there's a bit of a false distinction for saying there's a pendulum that goes from external barriers that are out there to women's choices, and that actually we should be concentrating on the two at the same time. We should be looking at how context, our organisational cultures, our societal structures, our gender stereotypes, our norms, how all of these things actually might shape and constrain women's choices. So for example, our ambitions, our motivation, our willingness to make sacrifice don't occur within a social vacuum, but rather they're shaped and constrained by organisational and social contexts, and importantly, how women see themselves in those contexts. So what I'd like to do for the rest of this talk is really look at how this might be the case and what this might look like. So we're going to look at 3 different streams of research that are all happening in parallel, and much of this work is ongoing. So in some ways, these are some preliminary ideas that we've got. But we're going to look in 3 areas. So we're going to look at women's workplace ambition and their career motivation more generally and the sorts of choices they make within their careers. We're going to look at work-life balance and the choices that women make in terms of balancing home and work life. And we're going to look at the types of risk and sacrifices that women are willing to make. Now, the reason that we're focusing on these 3 areas are that these are the areas that people often say are really underlying these gender differences. They say that women just aren't as ambitious, that they're more interested in having a better work-life balance, and that they're essentially risk-averse. And one of the things I'm interested in is saying, well, how does context, how does our organisational culture, how do our social norms, how do they affect ambition, work-life balance, and risk-taking? So I'm going to start off with ambition then. So one of the first questions we might say is, are there differences in ambition? There's certainly a stereotype or an expectation that women are less ambitious than men. But actually, when you look at the data, it's much more complicated than that. So this is some data from the UK Police Service that shows that when you look at new recruits into the police service, men and women are equally ambitious. But by 5 years into their careers, it changes so that women are much less ambitious compared to men. We can see this when we look at surgical trainees. We can show that in their first year of training, men and women are equally ambitious, but by their 3rd year, while men's ambition goes up, women's ambition goes down. And we can show this with a large sample of undergraduates at a large UK university that might or might not be the University of Exeter, that shows that at least in the sciences, which is the most male-dominated sort of faculty, while men and women have absolutely equal levels of ambition in first year, by 3rd year, you get this large gender difference. So we absolutely show differences in ambition, but only after a certain period of time. Now, what comes up and what's interesting to me here is the importance of context. So it's not that women across the board are less ambitious than men, but they become less ambitious over time. Now, when I talk to certain people about this data, one of the things that sort of often comes up is saying, well, that's easy to explain, right? There's just this certain biological clock that kicks in at a certain time, and women go from being ambitious to, I don't know what, wanting to spend more time at home and look after children. That there is something about women's biology, or in terms of those sorts of things, that just mean that ambition drops off over time. Now, on the face of it, that sounds vaguely plausible, but actually when you look at the data, it's not really plausible at all. So we're looking at undergraduate students, and their ambition drops off between about 18 and 21. We're looking at police officers. Their ambition drops off between the early 20s and their mid-20s. When we look at surgical trainees, their ambition drops off between their early 30s and their mid-30s. So these are actually really, really different times in women's lifespan. It's not that biological clocks are suddenly kicking in. Actually, what's consistent across those 3 things is not some sort of maternal clock ticking down, but much more the fact that these women have actually spent a fairly significant period of time in a pretty male-dominated environment, in the operating theatre, on the beat in the police force, or in the science lab. All of these are pretty male-dominated environments. So what's consistent there is nothing to do with biology or a maternal need, but actually being in situations that are relatively male-dominated. And this is what our evidence actually shows. That there is something about being in pretty male-dominated environments that changes how women think and changes their ambition as well. So we can conceive of this as being around fit and around belonging. So if we think of fit and belonging as the presence of others further up the career ladder, if you're in a male-dominated environment, like surgery, like police, like science, that experience is very different for men and for women. For men, when they look up, when they look at their role models, when they look ahead, and in fact, that's exactly what ambition is like, isn't it? Ambition is about putting yourself forward, thinking about where you will be. I sit on a lot of hiring and promotion committees, and we always want to know about people's ambition, right? They're the people you want to hire. You want to hire ambitious people. And the question we always ask is, where do you see yourself in 10 years' time? And depending on how they answer that, we can get an idea of their ambition. But in order to answer that, you've got to project yourself forward. Where will you be in 10 years' time? Who's 10 years ahead of you? So when you're looking up, men go, well, who's 10 years ahead of me? Someone that looks a bit like me. You know, look up, see people like that, right? But for women, when they look up, they see this, not really like them, right? It's harder to project yourself forwards. Where am I going to be in 10 years' time? Don't know, probably not there. No one like me there. So there's this idea that there's a certain thing about being in a male-dominated environment that might affect your ability to project yourself forward and your ability to express ambition. So we've done some work with police officers where we've tried to look at this relationship between fit and belonging and ambition. So this is a study initial pilot study that we've done with 62 police women, where we've asked them to describe themselves on a whole range of different traits, not just these 6 here, but a range of, I think, 25 traits or so. And we asked them to describe how well each of these words described them as an individual, but also how well those words described successful senior officers, those people up ahead of them. So you can see this person said collaborative. Yep, well, I'm pretty collaborative. On a scale of -2 to +2, I'm collaborative. Senior officers are less so. Yeah, I'm fairly sociable, but not so much senior officers. Decisive, I'm not that decisive, but senior officers definitely are, and so on. And we can find a number of findings based on this data. And we can show that female officers are much more likely to, I guess non-surprisingly, describe themselves in terms of stereotypically feminine traits, and rather than stereotypically masculine traits. But when they're describing senior officers, they're much more likely to describe them in terms of stereotypically masculine traits rather than stereotypically feminine traits. But what's much more interesting, I think, is that what you can do is calculate a fit score to basically say how far removed is their descriptions of themselves away from their descriptions of senior officers, and see how close that fit is. And what we find is a lack of fit. The bigger the distance between how you describe yourself and how you describe senior officers very much predicts a lack of ambition and a greater desire to exit, to opt out of a career in policing. So we've got this idea that ambition might be very much related to this idea of fitting in, of belonging, of having role models. But one of the questions we wanted to say is, well, can we do anything about that? Is that just a given then? If women don't fit in, they're not going to be ambitious, we may as well give up. So are there ways of actually improving fit and improving feelings of belonging? So we did a study, again, with a large group of UK police women. And what we tried to do is see whether we could improve ideas of fit and belonging. So we asked participants to complete a leadership inventory. We informed them that they either had transformational or transactional leadership style. You don't really need to know what that involves, but either one leadership style or the other if you're not familiar with that work. But what was important is that we informed them either that the majority of leaders in the police force had the same leadership style as them or had a different leadership style to them. Okay, so they either felt that their leadership style either fit or did not fit with those that were successful ahead of them. And then we got them to do a second questionnaire that they thought was separate, where we asked about their career ambition and their career commitment. And what we found is that it didn't matter whether we told them that they were either transformational or transactional. What really mattered was whether we said that they really fit in or they didn't. And those that fit in, those in the red bar, showed much more ambition than those who were told that they didn't fit in. And those that fit in had much more commitment to their careers than those that didn't. Now, I think what's really important is that we use an evidence base to design interventions. What I don't want you to do is go back to your employees and lie to them about their leadership style so they either fit or don't fit in. So what this study isn't a real-life intervention that you can take home, but what it does show is that you can change feelings of fit and belonging. And that to the extent that you can make people feel like they fit in, they will be more committed and they will be more ambitious. So the implications then in terms of ambition is that women's ambition and their feelings of motivation are very much related to their feelings of belonging and their expectations of success. Do they have role models? Are there people like them at the top? How easy is it to imagine that they can be at the top as well? And it's important to note, not just the blanket statement, are women ambitious or not, but can organisations provide a culture and a context that fuels women's ambition and their motivation, rather than stymieing it? Okay, the second theme then, work-life balance. One of the reasons that we wanted to look at this is that when you look at exit interviews of women who opt out or go part-time, they often say it's about work-life balance. I want a better work-life balance. I don't want to do the long hours, so I'm not going to put myself up for promotion. I don't want to do the long hours, so I'm going to be a GP rather than a surgeon. I don't want to do the long hours because I want to have more of a life outside of work. Now, I'm actually a massive proponent of work-life balance, so don't get me wrong, I absolutely believe in work-life balance. But actually, I think that work-life balance is more complex than that. I also think that if we take at face value exit interviews about why people leave and we just take the, oh, you just want a better work-life balance, I think we're missing a bit of a trick. It's a pretty easy, acceptable way. You know, we often talk about gardening leave and all of those sorts of things. They're actually not gardening, it's something else. Okay, so what is it about work-life balance that might be affecting women's career choices? Now, we often talk about work-life balance about being about time, about balancing time at home and time at work, and about being able to work in ways that work well. We've done some work with the Royal College of Surgeons, and this is partly because even though women are coming in at great numbers into medical school and actually doing just as well, if not better, than men at medical school, they're going into surgery at much lower rates. So in the UK, only 25% of surgical trainees are women. So the Royal College of Surgeons came to us really wanting to try and understand this, and also understand why it is that women had a much higher dropout out of surgical training as well. Now, one of the reasons they said was, well, it's about work-life balance, right? Women don't want to be surgeons because you've got to be on call, you've got to do long hours, it's often unpredictable. And I guess what I said was, that's kind of interesting because midwives are always women, almost exclusively. Unpredictable, long hours, don't know when you're going to be there or not, but actually they don't get paid very much money, so it's probably acceptable in that sort of way. So I guess what's really interesting is that these choices aren't always about work-life balance. There's plenty of roles where women actually have terrible work-life balance. Look at nurses, for example, as well. So we started working with the surgeons to understand issues of work-life balance and looking at how it might be more complicated than just balancing time. We looked at 367 female members of the Royal College of Surgery. We asked about their work-life balance, about their ambition, their performance, their burnout and stress, about their turnover intentions. We asked about fitting in. We asked about how much they identified with being a surgeon. We asked not just about work-life balance, but also about work-life compatibility. How compatible is who you are at home and who you are at work? Not just time, but identity. We asked about their expectations of success. We also asked about their willingness to take sacrifices. And this is what we found. We found that work-life balance actually was an incredibly good predictor of things like ambition in terms of performance and burnout and turnover intentions. And we also found that time, the amount of time that people felt that they were working, was a pretty good predictor of work-life balance. But what the best predictor of work-life balance was fitting in, feeling that you belong, feeling that people like you have made it. And the reason for this was twofold. There were kind of two routes between fitting in and having a good work-life balance. To the extent that these women felt like they fit in, they also felt like who they were at home and who they were at work were compatible with each other. And this was in part because if you fit in, They identified really strongly with being a surgeon. They felt like they belonged, they felt like they were part of the surgical community, and therefore they had this compatibility. To the extent that they fit in, that they felt like others above them were similar to them, they were also more willing to make sacrifices for their career. They're more likely to give things up for their career. And that was because they were more likely to feel like they would succeed. People like you up top, I'm more willing to succeed. And if I'm going to succeed, well, I'm going to give things up. Or the flip side of that, if there isn't anyone like me at the top, why would I give things up? Especially if it's not going to go anywhere. So the implications then is that women's issues with work-life balance may not just be about balancing time. It might also be about balancing identity, who one is at home and who one is at work, and also about balancing sacrifice with expectations of success. Now, the important thing is that most of our interventions around work-life balance are about time. We offer flexible working, we offer part-time working, work from home, long maternity leaves. All of those things are great, and don't get me wrong, I'm very supportive of those. I don't work more than 40 hours a week either. I'm a big proponent of work-life balance. But what's important is that those interventions only address time. At worst, they could actually exacerbate those issues. If feeling like you don't fit in and belong, if you work part-time, that's only going to exacerbate that problem. Who at the top works part-time? Who at the top works flexibly? Okay? So it may only address a very small part of the issue. Okay, so just finally, the last session on sacrifice and risk. We finally got a large sample of both men and women, so you can see that part of the research that we've done before has just been on women, and partly that's just about who we get access to. Now we've got a big grant, we've got access to lots of people, so it's great. But this was with a large professional services company where we got 870 middle managers, men and women. This company was particularly interested because while they had a great influx of graduates and they were doing incredibly well at middle management, when it came to making partner, women were still incredibly underrepresented. And they had many women choosing not to put themselves forward to partner. So we looked at a whole range of different things. And what was really interesting is that we found almost zero differences between men and women. They didn't differ in terms of their ambition or their performance or their work-life balance, not even in terms of the extent to which they fit in. But what they did differ on was their willingness to make sacrifices and their willingness to take risks. So women were just less likely to do those things. Now, what's really interesting is that if you go back to some of the stereotypes, people will just say, well, that's why. That's why they're not making partner. They're not taking risks. They're not making sacrifices. But what was interesting is that the only other gender difference that we found is that when you asked men and women about the benefits of taking risks and the benefits of making sacrifices, women were less likely to say that there were benefits there. And actually, they're probably right. There's a gender pay gap, about 18 to 20%. So actually, there's less benefits for making risks, just tangible, less pay. There's also potentially larger sacrifices to make in terms of the sorts of norms that society has in terms of who, say, looks after the children or who should be the primary breadwinner. So what was interesting is that the gender differences in risk and sacrifice were completely explained by those differences in the benefits that were there. And importantly, those benefits were affected by the extent to which men and women expected to succeed, the availability of role models, whether there was support, and whether they thought their organisation was fair and meritocratic. So I think the take-home message there is that women probably undertake this clear cost-benefit analysis when evaluating risk and sacrifice. So organisations need to understand the gendered nature of these costs and benefits. And the idea, I think, is that women will take risks and will make sacrifices when there are rewards and benefits to doing so. So just to wrap it up then, I think that women's choices, are important to look at. But we shouldn't just necessarily take them on face value. We need to understand how they're shaped and constrained by context. So decisions about ambition, about work-life balance, about risk and sacrifice, all depend on feeling like you fit in, whether you belong, and on other contextual factors as well. And I think it's important that organisations create contexts that can encourage and facilitate women's careers and their choices. And if we're talking about leaning in, if we're going to empower women to lean in, to make the right choices, we have to make sure that we give them something to lean towards. Okay, thanks.